I was having a pretty normal morning, at least by my standards. The sun was shining through the blinds just enough to make me squint, but not enough to ruin the cozy atmosphere of my living room. A cup of coffee in my hand, I was on my second round of scrolling through social media, judging people's breakfast choices, when the doorbell rang. Now, I'm not the kind of person who gets a lot of unexpected visitors, so I wasn't expecting anyone. Maybe it was the mailman, but he was usually smart enough to just drop the package and leave. I glanced at the clock, 9:30 a.m. Weird time for someone to be showing up. I set my coffee on the table and walked over to the door. There, on my doorstep, stood a woman holding a large envelope. She looked like she belonged in one of those bad neighbor documentaries. You know, the kind where everyone in the neighborhood whispers about her as she patrols the streets with a clipboard. I tried to give her a friendly smile, but it felt more like I was doing her a favor by acknowledging her existence. "Hi, I'm with the HOA," she said, flashing a smile that could only be described as fake, like a politician giving a speech about world peace. "I need to give you this." I stared at the envelope she handed me. "HOA?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. She nodded. "Yes, it's an important notice." Before I could even ask what the hell was going on, she turned and walked off. I watched her disappear down the street before opening the envelope, fully expecting it to be some generic, "we're updating our rules" kind of nonsense. But what I found inside made my stomach drop. It was a formal eviction notice. An eviction notice from my own home. I blinked, read it again. Yep, still there. It was as though someone had written a prank and decided to put it in an official-looking letterhead to make it official. Apparently my front door was too bold in color, a shade of red that clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic, and that my driveway was overrun with weeds, despite me having cleared it 2 weeks ago. According to the HOA, this was a violation of some bylaw that, for the life of me, I had never heard of. Now I was being told I had 10 days to either paint my front door a more neutral shade or face eviction. I read it over and over, but it didn't change. How could they even do this? Too bold. I was tempted to walk over to my front door and stare at it in confusion. Bold my ass. It was red, yes, but it was a good red. A vibrant, happy red that I loved, not a "you need to tone it down" red. I should have just ignored the letter. I mean, this couldn't be real, right? But there was something about it, the official tone, the neatly typed rules about harmonizing with the community, and the threats that made me feel like I was trapped in some absurd sitcom. And the fact that the letter had my name on it in bold, official-looking ink made it hard to ignore. There was one thing that stood out, though. At the very bottom, there was a date, court date, Thursday, 2:00 p.m. Wait, court like real court. I sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the letter in my hand. My first thought was, this has to be some kind of mistake. Someone's messing with me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no choice but to show up. It was either that or risk whatever crazy, absurd punishment these people would come up with next. What kind of person gets evicted for having a bold door? Who even writes those kinds of bylaws? Apparently, the people who run the HOA in my neighborhood. Now, for a little context, my neighborhood is exactly what you'd call cutthroat. It's quiet. People are mostly friendly, if a little too interested in what you're doing. But no one had ever told me there was some mysterious HOA rulebook that governs the color of your door or the number of weeds on your driveway or whatever. And the HOA president? Oh, that's Karen. Yes, the very Karen you're thinking of, the one with a clipboard in her hand at all times, as if she's conducting some kind of survey on what is and isn't acceptable in her perfect little world. Karen was one of those people who took the rules a little too seriously. No, scratch that. She took them way too seriously. If there was an award for the most pedantic HOA president, she'd win it, no contest. I mean, the woman once spent 3 hours measuring everyone's lawns to ensure they were exactly the same length. And God help you if you were caught outside mowing your lawn at the wrong time of day. So yeah, I had a feeling this whole thing was her doing. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. An eviction notice for a red door? I'd had enough of Karen's nonsense. I wasn't about to let her push me around. But what could I do? She had the power of the HOA behind her, and I had my front door and a decent sense of humor. By the time I realized what a wild situation I was in, the clock was ticking. I had a court date in less than 2 days. And the worst part, I had no idea how to fight this. How do you argue that a door is too bold? I figured I'd show up in court, do my best to keep it together, and let the judge laugh Karen out of the room. After all, this was insane. And that's when it hit me. This was going to be a showdown. A showdown between the HOA, Karen, and me, the regular homeowner just trying to live a normal life. I was going to need a plan, and I had exactly 2 days to come up with one. So I did what anyone would do in my position. I Googled how to deal with HOA evictions and crossed my fingers that I wouldn't need to hire a lawyer. By the time I finished my coffee, I had a solid plan. Show up at court, bring my sarcasm and charm, and prove to everyone just how ridiculous this whole thing was. And maybe, just maybe, I'd get to see Karen's face when the judge tossed her case out the window. But first, I needed to figure out how to deal with the one thing I wasn't prepared for. How to face off with Karen in front of a judge without completely losing my cool. I'd never been to court before, but I had a feeling it was going to be a lot more entertaining than I ever imagined. And I was about to make this Karen wish she'd never messed with me. But first, breakfast. Because you know a girl needs her energy when she's about to face down a HOA tyrant. It's amazing how quickly you can go from being a relaxed homeowner enjoying your morning coffee to feeling like you're about to be the star of a courtroom drama. It was the morning of the hearing, and I had my "I'm about to destroy you" face on. I'd put on my best outfit, something that said, "I'm serious but also sarcastic and underwhelmed by your nonsense." I was determined to look like $1,000,000, even if the only thing I had going for me was my confidence and a really, really well-worn pair of shoes. The court building looked exactly how you'd expect it to, gray, cold, and filled with an atmosphere of tension that made my stomach knot up just a little bit. I walked in trying to hold my head high, but I'm pretty sure my nerves were showing. I've never been to court before, so this was uncharted territory for me. Still, I was ready to face off with Karen. And honestly, after the stunt she'd pulled, I had a feeling this would be entertaining, if nothing else. As I stepped into the courtroom, I immediately spotted her. Karen. Sitting in the front row, of course, looking like she was about to lecture the entire room on how everyone's life could be improved if they just followed the rules. She had that same smug look on her face, like she'd already won. And maybe, just maybe, she thought this was going to be a simple case, one of those easy victories where she got to have her moment of power and maybe give me a smug little wave as I walked out, defeated. Not today. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I approached the bench, but I forced myself to sit up straight. I wasn't going to let her see me sweat. My lawyer wasn't even here, because let's face it, who needed one for a ridiculous HOA eviction based on a red door? So it was just me, my red door, and a court full of strangers who were about to witness a spectacle. The judge entered, and everyone stood up. He was an older man, wearing thick glasses and a tie that was probably from the 90s. The kind of guy who had probably seen his fair share of ridiculous cases, but was clearly growing tired of them. When he sat down, he gave the room a quick glance, then turned his attention to the paperwork in front of him. "All right, let's get this over with," the judge muttered under his breath. He didn't even look up as he spoke. I guess he was already anticipating the absurdity that was about to unfold. And I couldn't blame him. "Ms. Johnson, I believe you are the one being accused of," he paused, squinting at the paper, "having an unapproved front door color. Is that correct?" I held back a snort. "Yes, Your Honor, that's correct." The judge lifted an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that level of sarcasm. He looked over at Karen, who was sitting there like she had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. He wasn't buying it, though, not for a second. "And you, Ms. Karen," he said, looking directly at her. "You're the president of the HOA." "Yes, Your Honor," she answered with a saccharine smile. "I'm just doing my duty to ensure the integrity of our neighborhood." I almost gagged. Integrity, really? The judge nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through the papers. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head. Maybe he was wondering how he'd ended up with such a ridiculous case, or maybe he was just trying to figure out whether this was real life or a fever dream. "All right, let's hear your case, Ms. Karen," the judge said. "Tell me why we're in court today." Karen stood up, walking over to the lectern with an air of triumph. If there was one thing she was good at, it was playing the victim in front of a crowd. She held out a set of photos like they were the Holy Grail, laying them out one by one as if she were presenting irrefutable evidence of a heinous crime. "Your Honor, I've compiled these images to show the egregious violation of our neighborhood rules," she began, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. "As you can see, the front door is far too bright, too bold. It disrupts the harmony of the entire street." She flipped to the next photo. And here, you can clearly see the overgrown weeds in the driveway. This is a clear violation of our landscaping standards. As you can tell, this homeowner has absolutely no regard for the community. I almost burst out laughing. First of all, the weeds were barely noticeable. Second, I was just supposed to accept that my red door was now a crime against humanity. It was like she was auditioning for some HOA reality TV show and wanted to be the villain. The judge didn't seem impressed. He squinted at the photos for a few moments, then placed them down on his desk. "Ms. Karen," he said, sounding like he was about to scold a child, "are these the only issues you have with the homeowner's property?" Karen nodded confidently. "Yes, Your Honor, these are serious violations. They affect the entire aesthetic of the neighborhood." The judge exhaled heavily, resting his chin on his hand. "And what exactly is the punishment for these violations, according to your HOA rules?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, I interrupted. "Your Honor," I said loudly, causing everyone in the courtroom to turn toward me. "With all due respect, are we really going to make a big deal out of a door and a couple of weeds? My driveway's been cleared, the weeds are tiny, and the color of my door is a personal choice. I'm not sure where this harmonizing the neighborhood nonsense fits in the Constitution, but I didn't realize I signed up for a dictatorship when I moved in." The room went silent for a moment, then a few stifled chuckles broke out. The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, so I took that as my cue to keep going. "I mean, can someone explain to me how a red door is a problem? It's not like I have flamingos in the yard or a giant inflatable Santa Claus taking up half the lawn. No offense to anyone who does, but we're talking about a door, not a clown car of tacky decorations." The judge leaned back in his chair, looking more entertained than anything else. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she might explode. I could practically see her grinding her teeth in the front row. "Ms. Johnson," the judge said, still looking like he was holding back a grin, "I appreciate your humor, but let's try to stay on track here. I'm asking about the punishment. Ms. Karen, what exactly does the HOA propose in terms of consequences?" Karen straightened up, puffing her chest out like she was about to deliver the death blow. "We're asking for the homeowner to either paint the door to a more neutral color or face eviction," she said with a sharp nod. "This is a violation of multiple HOA rules." I stared at her in disbelief. "Eviction for a red door?" Karen looked smug as she nodded. "Yes, eviction. It's the only way to maintain the integrity of our community." I looked at the judge. He didn't even try to hide the smirk on his face now. "Eviction," he said slowly, clearly amused. "For a red door and some weeds." Karen's eyes sparkled with the belief that she was winning. I, on the other hand, felt a rush of determination. This was too absurd to let slide, and I was going to make sure Karen knew it. "Well, Your Honor," I said, crossing my arms, "I'd like to point out that this whole thing is ridiculous. I've been a homeowner here for years. I'm not going to be bullied by someone who spends their time policing people's front doors." The judge turned to Karen. "Ms. Karen, do you have any further evidence to present?" Karen shook her head, looking slightly flustered now. "No, Your Honor." "Then," the judge said, leaning forward, "I think we're done here for today." I couldn't help but smile. There was a chance, just a small one, that this was actually going in my favor. This was about to get interesting. I don't think I'll ever forget the moment Karen completely lost the plot. It's one thing to be petty and absurd, but when she went from being just the neighborhood's overzealous rule enforcer to a full-on, frothing-at-the-mouth lunatic, I knew I was in for an absolute ride. The judge had called a short recess after his initial questioning. I leaned back in my seat, trying not to let my nerves get the better of me. The tension in the room had been palpable, and I was still digesting the fact that I'd just publicly mocked an HOA president to her face in front of a judge. The glares she sent my way could have melted steel. If looks could kill, I would have been dead by the time the recess was over. As I stood up to stretch my legs, Karen marched right up to the front of the courtroom, clutching a new stack of papers. I thought she was just going to huff and puff about my flippant attitude, but no. She was preparing to escalate this nonsense to a whole new level. "Your Honor," Karen's voice sliced through the chatter like a knife through butter, "I've brought additional evidence that proves just how serious these violations are." The judge, who looked like he'd had just about enough of this entire circus, didn't even look up from his papers as he waved a hand dismissively. "All right, Ms. Karen, let's hear it." Karen was practically trembling with excitement as she presented her new batch of so-called evidence. She fanned the papers out like she was showing off some highly classified government documents. I crossed my arms, my eyebrow arched. Whatever she had, it was going to be even more ridiculous than the last set of photos she brought in. Your Honor, Karen began with all the drama of a courtroom movie, these are the results of a professional inspection of the property. I hired an expert to assess the condition of the yard and the entire exterior of the home. This professional confirmed my suspicion. This house is a blight on the neighborhood. At this point, I almost laughed out loud. A professional inspector? Really? How much was she paying this person to back up her crazy? The only thing more absurd than this situation was the fact that she thought anyone in that courtroom would take her seriously. The judge looked up now, clearly curious but not convinced. Go on, Ms. Karen, let's see what you've got. She flipped open her first sheet of paper dramatically and read aloud. First of all, the front door is a violent shade of red. It doesn't blend in with the surroundings and could cause distress to anyone who has a sensitive eye. She paused, expecting the room to gasp in horror at the mere idea of a red door being an emotional hazard. When no one reacted, she continued with more gusto. And if you turn your attention to this report, Karen added, rifling through the papers like she was unveiling hidden treasure, you'll see that the driveway has been deemed unsafe because of the weeds growing in the cracks. These weeds pose a severe trip hazard and are a liability. This could result in injury to anyone walking by, especially the elderly. I blinked. Wait, did she just call my driveway unsafe because of a few dandelions? I was almost too stunned to process what was happening, but somehow I managed to keep a straight face. The judge, on the other hand, had his hand over his eyes like he couldn't bear to watch anymore. Are you telling me, he asked slowly, that this house is unsafe because of a few weeds and the color of the front door? Karen, absolutely oblivious to the absurdity of her argument, nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Your Honor. The HOA's role is to ensure safety and harmony in our community, and these violations are a clear disruption. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my legs. There was no way I was letting this woman win. Your Honor, I said, standing up and addressing the court, with all due respect, what's next? Are we going to start ticketing people for having a mailbox that's too blue, or maybe their bushes are too bushy? Karen shot me a glare so sharp it almost gave me whiplash, but I didn't care. The judge raised his hand to quiet me, but there was a small smile tugging at his lips. Ms. Johnson, he said, let's keep it civil. Ms. Karen, do you have any more expert opinions on the state of this house? She didn't even flinch. Yes, Your Honor. In fact, I have additional documents from an independent consultant on curb appeal who has noted that this property severely detracts from the aesthetic quality of our neighborhood. The entire house's value is in jeopardy. The judge raised an eyebrow. So you're telling me that one red door and some weeds in the driveway are somehow lowering the value of the entire neighborhood? Karen nodded, her eyes wide and filled with righteous indignation. Absolutely, Your Honor. This homeowner is undermining everything we've worked so hard to build here. It's not just the house, it's the very integrity of the community itself. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Are you serious? I asked, louder than I probably should have. This is what we're doing. Are we really going to waste the court's time with this? My house is causing the integrity of the neighborhood to crumble. What's next? Are you going to tell me my doormat is offensive? The courtroom went quiet. I looked over at the judge, who was clearly trying not to laugh, but he quickly regained composure. Ms. Karen, he said slowly, let's take a moment and remember the context here. We're in court because you claim this homeowner is in violation of HOA rules. But we need to address whether or not the alleged violations are actually, well, violations. Because right now I'm not sure I'm seeing a problem that requires eviction. Karen's face twisted with frustration. Your Honor, I'm simply trying to uphold the standards of our neighborhood. She was cut off by the loud sound of the courtroom door opening. A figure in a suit walked in, holding a briefcase. I turned to see a man in his mid-40s with glasses, looking completely out of place in the dramatic circus that had become my day. He gave me a polite smile before addressing the judge. Excuse me, Your Honor, the man said in a low voice. I'm the consultant Ms. Karen mentioned. I've been called to testify about the curb appeal of the property in question. My jaw nearly hit the floor. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered to myself. Karen grinned like a cat who just found the cream. This is exactly what I was talking about, Your Honor. We need professionals who know what they're talking about. I had to bite my tongue to keep from making a sarcastic comment. There was no way this guy was a real expert. The entire thing was becoming more and more ridiculous by the second. The judge looked at the man with a mixture of interest and exhaustion. All right, let's hear your expert opinion, but please, let's keep this brief. The man adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and looked at the papers in front of him. Yes, Your Honor. After thoroughly reviewing the property, I can confirm that the color of the front door is a clear violation of modern architectural standards. Red is a color known to cause agitation, and the stark contrast it creates against the surrounding environment can lead to emotional distress. I almost couldn't believe my ears. Emotional distress. Excuse me, I interrupted, my voice rising. Are we seriously talking about emotional distress now, because of a door? The judge raised a hand, clearly done with this entire circus. We get it, Ms. Karen, he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Now, do you have any real evidence that shows how this impacts anyone's safety or well-being? Karen hesitated, looking like she just had the wind knocked out of her. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. I have one more piece of evidence, she said, her voice tinged with desperation. I'd like to call in an additional expert witness. At this point, I could hardly wait to see what kind of ridiculousness was about to unfold. Go ahead, the judge said with a sigh, probably wondering how many more experts this circus could possibly produce. I leaned back in my chair, bracing myself. If Karen was going to keep going, I was definitely going to have the last laugh. This wasn't just about a red door anymore. This was personal, and I was ready to make sure Karen knew she'd messed with the wrong person. Let's see what she had left in her bag of tricks. At this point, I wasn't sure whether I was in a courtroom or on the set of a bad comedy show. If someone had told me I'd be sitting here listening to Karen and her experts try to convince a judge that my red door was a crime against humanity, I would have laughed and offered them a drink. But here I was, watching an actual grown man who called himself a curb appeal that my front door was causing emotional distress. I could feel my brain starting to short-circuit. Karen had just presented her expert, consultant, who had a whole speech ready about how the color red was scientifically proven to make people feel uncomfortable and unstable. Honestly, I don't know whether to feel more insulted by the audacity of it all or just impressed at the sheer gall Karen had in dragging someone else into her delusions. The judge, however, didn't seem nearly as entertained by the nonsense as I was. If anything, he looked like he'd reached the end of his patience. All right, he said, rubbing his temples, let's take a step back. This is becoming a circus. The room went silent. Even Karen stopped her dramatic eye roll and looked up, probably shocked that the judge had the nerve to challenge her. I've had enough of these expert opinions, the judge continued, his voice calm but firm. We're talking about a red door and some weeds, for heaven's sake. Let's not lose sight of what's actually going on here. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point I'd been waiting for. Finally, someone was seeing how ridiculous this whole thing was. The judge turned his attention to Karen. Ms. Karen, this whole situation has spiraled far beyond what any reasonable person would consider a violation of HOA rules. You've had your say, and so has your so-called expert. Now it's time for me to make a decision. I leaned forward in my chair, practically on the edge of my seat. The tension in the room was suffocating. My heart was pounding. Was this the moment when it would all end? Karen's face was a picture of disbelief. But, Your Honor, No more, the judge cut her off. I've had enough. This isn't about the color of the door, the weeds in the driveway, or anything else you've presented. This is about reasonable enforcement of rules, and what you've shown me so far is an abuse of power. I had to blink, not sure if I was hearing him right. My mind was racing. Was the judge actually siding with me, after all that nonsense Karen had pulled? Ms. Karen, the judge continued, if this HOA is going to enforce rules, they must be based on something that is both legal and reasonable. What you've shown me doesn't meet that standard. So let me be clear, I'm not going to evict this homeowner over a red door or a few weeds. I could feel my chest relax as I exhaled. The tension that had been building for hours finally started to loosen. I wasn't losing this case, not today. Karen's face turned redder than my door. She was beyond furious now, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the lectern. I'd never seen someone so unwilling to accept defeat, and honestly, it was kind of entertaining. "But Your Honor, the integrity of our neighborhood is at stake," she cried, desperation dripping from her words. "If we allow these kinds of violations to go unchecked, then what's next? People will start doing whatever they want, and our entire community will fall apart." The judge raised a hand, cutting her off once again. "Ms. Karen, the only thing falling apart here is your credibility, and frankly, it's embarrassing that we've spent this much time discussing something so trivial. It's a red door. It's weeds. I'm not going to drag this out any longer." I was stunned. The judge was actually putting his foot down. This whole thing was finally coming to an end, and it was going in my favor. Karen, however, wasn't done. She stood there for a moment, her chest heaving as if she was trying to catch her breath. Then, with a sharp inhale, she snapped, "You can't just dismiss this case. There are rules, and I will take this to a higher court if I have to." I couldn't help myself. I had to speak up. "Good luck with that, Karen," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure the higher court will be really concerned with your door trauma. Maybe you should start a support group for people who can't handle bold colors." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Karen's eyes narrowed and she shot me a death stare. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The judge was done with her antics, and I was done holding back. The judge sighed, clearly fed up with the whole ordeal. "Ms. Karen," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I'll tell you what. You can take this case as far as you like, but let me make one thing clear. If you do, I will personally ensure that your actions are investigated. From what I've seen, this HOA is abusing its power and forcing homeowners to comply with ridiculous, unenforceable rules. So before you start talking about appeals, I suggest you think long and hard about whether this is a battle you really want to continue." There was a brief moment of stunned silence. Even Karen looked a little shaken, as if she hadn't considered the possibility that the judge would turn the tables on her. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, she looked like she wasn't in control. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone now much more friendly, "you're free to go. There will be no eviction, and I'll be ordering the HOA to cease any further harassment. This case is dismissed." I felt like I was floating. My mind was still trying to process everything that had just happened. This was it. It was over. I won. The gavel came down with a loud bang, and the courtroom erupted into whispers. I didn't care about the whispers. All I cared about was the fact that I was leaving this place victorious. Karen didn't even look at me as I walked out of the courtroom. Her mouth was set in a tight line, and she was practically vibrating with rage. It was almost sad, really. How badly she wanted to be in control of everything, how desperate she was to make everyone follow her rules. But I wasn't going to let her ruin my life. I stepped out into the hallway, taking a deep breath. The fresh air felt good. The weight that had been pressing down on me for days was finally gone. I couldn't help but smile to myself. I had just outsmarted the most insufferable woman in the neighborhood, and I had the judge on my side to boot. I had gone up against a woman who thought she could control my life over the color of my front door, and I'd come out on top. But the best part, the absolute best part, I didn't even have to repaint my door. And that, my friends, was a victory worth celebrating. It's one thing to win in court, but it's another to watch the person who tried to ruin your life completely lose it. And that's exactly what happened the moment we stepped out of the courtroom. The door swung open, and there I was, walking out like I had just won an Olympic gold medal. Sure, I was still trying to process what had just happened, but I was feeling pretty damn good. I'd just outsmarted Karen, the HOA queen, in front of a judge. Not only had I kept my red door, but I was free to go home without a care in the world. I turned back to look at Karen, who was still sitting in her seat, staring at the judge's bench like she had just been slapped in the face. She hadn't moved a muscle since the gavel came down. Her whole body was stiff, and her hands were clenched into fists. It was almost like she was trying to physically hold on to her tiny bit of power, as if she stayed still long enough, the world would reverse, and she would be the one walking out victorious. But oh no, it wasn't happening. I had to admit, I kind of relished the sight of her sitting there, looking utterly defeated. She deserved it. Karen had been running this little HOA dictatorship for way too long, pushing people around like they were puppets. She had thought she could just waltz in and destroy my life because of a red door, of all things, and now she was getting a taste of her own medicine. As I walked through the hall toward the exit, I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see a lawyer, maybe a court officer, or someone else I didn't care about. But no, of course not. It was Karen, practically stalking me down the hallway like she was planning her next attack. I was almost impressed by the nerve she had to follow me. Maybe she thought she could still intimidate me, or maybe she was just looking for an outlet for her outrage. Either way, I wasn't having it. "Excuse me, Ms. Johnson," she said in a voice that was way too calm for someone who had just been publicly humiliated. "I'd like to talk to you for a moment." I stopped dead in my tracks and turned to face her. "Oh, you want to talk now?" I crossed my arms, raising an eyebrow. "What, you planning on asking me for forgiveness, for wasting my time with all this nonsense?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "You think this is over?" I could practically hear the venom in her words, and I knew instantly she wasn't about to let me go without trying to get in one final jab. She wasn't just upset, she was seething. And that made me feel a lot better about the whole situation. This was the moment where Karen had to realize that not everyone could be bullied into submission. "No, Karen," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm, "I'm pretty sure it's over. The judge said I'm free to go, and by the looks of it, I'm going to walk out of here and never hear from you again. Sounds like a win to me." She took a step closer, her breath quickening, as if the entire situation was building to a final, catastrophic explosion. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You think this is just about the door. This is bigger than that. You disrespected me in front of everyone. You embarrassed me." I just stared at her, incredulous. "Disrespected you?" I repeated, letting out a laugh that I couldn't keep in. "Karen, you tried to evict me from my home over a door color and a couple of weeds. How exactly was I supposed to show respect to that?" Karen's face flushed even darker, if that was even possible. She took another step closer, her lips trembling with fury. "You don't get it, do you?" she spat. "I've been fighting for this neighborhood. I've been keeping everything in line, making sure the rules are followed, making sure we don't have people like you ruining the place." "People like me?" I scoffed, finally losing my patience. "What's that supposed to mean? People who like to paint their front doors, people who don't let the HOA dictate their every move. Sorry if I'm not into being your puppet, Karen, but I'm not sorry for standing up for myself." Karen looked like she was about to launch into another one of her tirades, but before she could say anything else, I saw it. The thing that made me almost feel sorry for her, almost. Her hands were shaking now. She wasn't just mad, she was completely losing control. Her breath came faster, and for a split second I thought she might start crying. But no, Karen wasn't the type to cry. She was the type to rage. "Do you have any idea how hard I've worked for this?" she whispered, more to herself than to me, her voice suddenly quiet and unhinged. "I've worked for years to make sure everything stayed perfect, and now after everything I've done, you've ruined it, all of it." I didn't know what to say. Part of me almost wanted to feel bad for her. She'd clearly invested so much of her life into controlling this neighborhood, making sure everything was perfect in her eyes. But that wasn't my problem. Her obsession with controlling people had led her down a dark path, and now she was here, standing in front of me like a defeated soldier, ready to make her last stand. "Karen," I said, my voice surprisingly calm, "you have to understand that not everyone thinks the way you do. Not everyone wants to live in a place where the color of their door is scrutinized. You've spent so much time trying to preserve this neighborhood that you've completely forgotten what it means to just live in it." Her eyes flashed with something cold, and I knew she wasn't done. She wasn't going to let this go. But before she could open her mouth to snap back, I heard someone approaching us. It was the judge. Yes, the judge. He had followed us out of the courtroom, and I'm pretty sure he'd had enough of the drama, too. He was walking down the hall toward us with a determined look on his face, and I couldn't help but feel a little bit of relief wash over me. "Ms. Karen," the judge called, his voice firm and no nonsense. "I need to speak with you." Karen spun around, her eyes narrowing. "What?" she snapped, obviously still furious. "I believe you need to hear this, and hear it clearly." The judge took a step closer, his voice low and serious. "I've just contacted the state board about the actions you've been taking with your HOA. It's been brought to my attention that there have been several complaints about how your organization has been operating. This is not just about the case today. It's about the way you've been running the HOA for years. There will be an investigation, and you will be held accountable for your actions." I couldn't hide the grin that spread across my face. Karen looked like she had just been slapped again, harder this time. Her jaw clenched as she stared at the judge, clearly not knowing how to respond. "You're being investigated," the judge repeated, making sure she understood. "And I suggest you take some time to reconsider your behavior. You've pushed too many people too far, and it's time for things to change." I stood there, not even able to hide my smirk anymore. This was it. Karen had crossed a line. She had bullied enough people, and now the consequences were catching up with her. There was no escaping it now. I glanced at the judge as he turned and started walking away. He paused just for a moment to give me a small, knowing nod. He didn't need to say anything more. This was over, for good. Karen was left standing there, staring after the judge in shock, her face pale, her hands still shaking. For a moment, she looked like she might collapse right there in the hallway. But instead, she pulled herself together, straightened her back, and walked off with all the dignity she could muster, though it was clear she was shattered. I stood there for a few seconds, watching her go. It wasn't the victory I had expected, but it was satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated. Karen had spent years bullying people, controlling them with her HOA rules, and now the tables had turned. As I walked out of the courthouse, I couldn't help but feel lighter. This wasn't just a win for me. It was a win for everyone who had ever been at the mercy of a Karen-like figure. Today, I'd fought back. Today, I had shown that you don't have to back down when someone tries to control you. And that was the best feeling of all. The next few days were, well, they were a strange mix of relief, amusement, and a sense of victory that I couldn't quite shake off. Every time I looked at my red door, I felt a little rush of satisfaction. The Karen incident, as I started calling it in my head, had gone better than I ever expected. The judge had dismissed the case, and Karen was left with nothing but the mess she'd created for herself. But there was one thing that kept nagging at me. Karen hadn't just tried to evict me for a red door and some weeds. She'd made it personal. It wasn't just about the HOA rules. It was about power, control, and her need to assert herself over people who weren't willing to follow her strict, unbending idea of how things should be. And that meant I wasn't finished yet. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. But I knew I had to make sure Karen understood just how much of an impact her actions had on people. After all, she'd been trying to bully me for weeks. Now, it was time for her to feel a little taste of her own medicine. The first step, making sure her precious HOA came crashing down a little bit. I knew that this wasn't going to happen overnight. The judge had already warned Karen that the state board was investigating her, but I wasn't going to sit back and wait for them to handle it. No, I was going to give the investigation a little push, a little nudge. After all, Karen had left me with a lot of ammunition to use against her. I picked up the phone, dialing the number I'd memorized after a little digging on the state board. I wasn't going to be subtle. There was no point in trying to be polite at this stage. Karen had overplayed her hand, and it was time for her to feel the consequences. "Hello, this is the State HOA Oversight Committee. How can I help you?" I felt a smile tug at the corners of my lips. This was it. I was about to do exactly what Karen had been so terrified of. "Hi there," I said, doing my best to keep my voice even. "I'm calling because I've got some pretty serious concerns about a local HOA president. Her name is Karen Wells, and she's been using her position to harass homeowners in our neighborhood." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the person typing away. "Okay, what sort of harassment are you referring to?" they asked, their voice polite but curious. I leaned back in my chair, gathering my thoughts. I could have listed off 1,000 different things she had done, small, petty things designed to make people's lives harder. But I didn't need to go into all of it right away. I was going for the big stuff. "Well, for starters," I began, "she's been pushing people out of their homes using ridiculous HOA rules. I was almost evicted for a red door, and when I fought it in court, the judge made it clear that the rules she's enforcing are not only unreasonable but likely illegal. I've also heard complaints from other homeowners about being fined for absolutely nothing, like their grass being too tall or their flower beds not meeting her standards." The voice on the other end of the line grew more serious. "That sounds concerning. Do you have any proof of these actions? Any documentation or specific instances we can look into?" I took a deep breath. "I have plenty of proof. In fact, I have documents, photos, and even the official court records from my case. If you want it, I can send everything over to you. Karen's not exactly hiding her methods, and it's all there for anyone who wants to take a look." There was a quick exchange of words as the person on the other end jotted down the details. I could feel the momentum building as they made a note of everything I'd said. It was like I was watching the wheels of justice slowly begin to turn. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was actually making a difference, not just for me, but for everyone Karen had ever trampled on with her inflated sense of power. "We'll take it from here, ma'am," the person on the phone said, their tone shifting to one of professionalism. "I'll make sure this gets into the hands of our investigators right away. Thanks for bringing this to our attention." I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of satisfaction settle in. It was one thing to win in court. It was another to make sure someone like Karen would never feel safe in her role again. But that wasn't all. No, I wasn't about to leave it at just a complaint to the state board. That would have been too easy. The next step, making sure Karen knew exactly who was responsible for all this. The next morning, I strolled out of my house, casually looking over the street. I had to admit, I liked my neighborhood, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of a stranglehold Karen had on everyone. People were scared to fight back, scared of the fines, scared of her wrath. That had to change. People deserved to live in their homes without feeling like they were being constantly monitored by some overbearing dictator. I made my way to the local coffee shop, a small place down the street that was always filled with friendly faces and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was the kind of place where people would sit and chat about their day, gossiping about everything from the weather to the latest neighborhood drama. I'd been coming here for years, and I knew that this would be the perfect place to get the word out. I walked in, my eyes scanning the room. It didn't take long to spot a few familiar faces, the ones who always seemed to have the latest gossip. I made my way over to a table where two of my neighbors, Sue and Linda, were sitting, each with a coffee in hand. "Hey, you two," I greeted them with a grin. "Mind if I join you?" Sue looked up and smiled. "Of course, sit down. What's going on? You look like you've got something exciting to share." I shrugged, but I was practically bursting with excitement. "Oh, I do. You know Karen Wells, right? The HOA president." Both women nodded, their faces immediately dropping. They didn't have to say anything. Everyone knew what Karen had been like. She ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, and no one was ever brave enough to speak up about it. Not until now. "Well," I said, leaning in a little closer, "she tried to evict me, and guess what? I fought back." Sue's eyes went wide. "What, evicted over a red door?" I chuckled. "Yep, and it wasn't just me. She's been doing this to other people too, finding ridiculous reasons to force them to either comply or pay huge fines. But here's the best part. I won. The judge dismissed the case, and Karen is being investigated by the state board for her actions." Linda's jaw dropped. "No way, she's being investigated." I nodded. "Yup, and I've made sure the investigation is in full swing. I've sent in all the evidence, including the court records. Karen won't be able to bully anyone again, not if I have anything to do with it." The room was buzzing with excitement. More and more people gathered around as I told the story, and by the time I finished, Karen's reputation in our little community was in tatters. Word spread like wildfire, and it didn't take long before I could see people's attitudes change. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out suddenly felt empowered. They started coming up to me, thanking me for standing up to Karen, and telling me their own stories of how she'd bullied them into following her ridiculous rules. By the time I left the coffee shop, I felt like I had just sparked a revolution. The days of living in fear of Karen's HOA dictatorship were over. A few days later, I received a call from the state board. They confirmed that they were moving forward with their investigation, and they'd be reviewing Karen's actions in full. The words potential legal action were thrown around more than once, and I couldn't help but smile. And just like that, Karen had been completely outmaneuvered. She thought she could control me, control the neighborhood, but in the end, she was the one who'd lost everything. She had underestimated me, and now the community was stronger for it. I'd done more than just protect my home. I had helped free an entire neighborhood from the grip of someone who thought she was untouchable. And let me tell you, that's the kind of victory that stays with you. It wasn't just about the red door. It was about standing up for what's right. And no matter what happens next, Karen will always know that she messed with the wrong person. It's funny how quickly things can change. One moment I was just an ordinary homeowner trying to live my life, and the next I was a hero. Okay, maybe not a hero in the traditional sense, but I certainly felt like I'd pulled off something pretty spectacular. Karen, my beloved HOA tyrant, had tried to bully me out of my home, but instead she had found herself in the middle of an investigation. Not only had I fought back and won, but I'd also sparked a wave of change in the entire neighborhood. I couldn't help but feel a little smug about it. For years, Karen had been running around enforcing her ridiculous rules, making people's lives miserable all because she thought she could. And for a while, it worked. People were too scared to stand up to her, too scared to rock the boat, but I wasn't scared. And now, Karen was facing the consequences of her actions. The news spread like wildfire. I mean, it wasn't just the neighborhood talking. Everywhere I went, people were asking about the case. How had I done it? How had I stood up to Karen and won? The whole thing had become a bit of a local legend, which I didn't mind. It felt kind of good to be the person who broke the spell Karen had over this community. But here's the kicker. Karen was still trying to fight back. I hadn't heard from her in a while, and I'd started to think that maybe, just maybe, she had accepted defeat. But that was wishful thinking. One afternoon, just as I was about to settle in with a good book and a cup of tea, the doorbell rang. Now I've gotten used to random knocks at the door. Usually it's a delivery or a neighbor asking if I've seen their cat, or in the case of Karen, a nasty note about my front yard. But when I opened the door this time, I wasn't expecting the sight in front of me. Standing there was a man in a suit, holding a large envelope. His face was all business, the kind of guy who looks like he's used to giving bad news. "Are you Ms. Johnson?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. I raised an eyebrow, unsure what to expect. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" He gave a small nod, clearly prepared for this moment. "I'm from Karen Wells' legal team. We are here to inform you that an appeal has been filed regarding the ruling in your case. The HOA intends to take this to a higher court." My heart skipped a beat. Are you kidding me? Of course, Karen wasn't just going to accept defeat. She had too much pride to let it go. The fact that she was taking it to a higher court wasn't exactly a surprise, but still, this was insane. The judge had already made his decision. She'd lost, but Karen wasn't ready to give up. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "This case is over. You lost. Karen lost. The judge even warned her that her actions were illegal. What's there to appeal?" The man adjusted his glasses, looking like he had rehearsed this speech 1,000 times. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Johnson. However, Ms. Wells feels that the judge's ruling was incorrect and that the HOA was within its rights to enforce community standards. As such, they are challenging the decision." I stared at him, my mind racing. This was ridiculous. Karen was going to drag me back into the courts again just to prove a point? No way. I'd already fought this battle. I wasn't about to start all over again just because she had a bruised ego. I took a deep breath and stepped back from the door, motioning for him to come inside. I wasn't going to handle this standing out on the doorstep like some confused homeowner. "Come on in," I said. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you, but let's see what you've got." The lawyer stepped inside, setting the envelope down on my kitchen table. He slid it toward me, his expression unreadable. I sat down and flipped it open, expecting the same old legal jargon that made my eyes glaze over. But as I scanned the pages, something in the fine print caught my eye. The HOA wasn't just appealing the eviction ruling. They were also demanding monetary compensation for the alleged damages caused by my violation. Apparently, the emotional distress of dealing with my red door, and some weeds was worth a hefty sum in their eyes. I burst out laughing. I couldn't help it. This was absurd. They were trying to sue me over a door. "Is this for real?" I asked, still chuckling. "Emotional distress? You've got to be kidding me." The lawyer didn't smile, didn't flinch. He just nodded, as though this was a completely reasonable request. "Ms. Johnson, I know this is a difficult situation, but the HOA believes this matter must be settled in a higher court. They intend to pursue this until a final ruling is made." I stared at the paper for a few more seconds before looking back up at him. "Tell Karen she's wasting her time. Tell her that I'm not going to back down, and if she thinks I'm afraid of some court battle, she's sorely mistaken." The lawyer looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing he were anywhere but here. "I'm just the messenger, Ms. Johnson, but I'll pass along your thoughts." He gathered up the papers, and just as he turned to leave, I spoke up again. "Wait," I said, catching his attention. "You can tell Karen one more thing from me." He paused at the door, looking at me expectantly. "Tell her that if she really wants a fight, she's got one. I'm not backing down. And the next time she tries to mess with me, I'll make sure the entire neighborhood knows exactly what she's been up to." I gave him a pointed look. "You can tell her that I said it." The lawyer nodded quickly, probably just wanting to escape. "I'll pass that along, Ms. Johnson." And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing there with my thoughts. At first, I felt a little bit of unease settle in. Was I ready to go through all this again? But then I remembered how far I'd come already. I wasn't some pushover, and I wasn't going to let Karen have the last word. The whole neighborhood was counting on me now. People were already talking about the case, discussing how the HOA had overstepped its bounds, and I wasn't about to let Karen turn this into a drawn-out legal mess just because her ego couldn't handle a loss. A few days later, I received another call, this time from the state board that had been investigating Karen's actions. "Ms. Johnson," the voice on the phone said, "I wanted to inform you that we've reviewed the complaint, and based on the evidence, we've decided to take further action. We'll be launching a full investigation into Karen Wells and her conduct as HOA president. We have also advised the HOA to suspend her from her position while we conduct our review." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Not only was Karen going to face legal consequences, but the HOA was finally being forced to do something about her abuse of power. This was it. This was the moment when everything shifted. The investigation was underway, and Karen's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The higher court appeal, it was just a formality at this point. Karen was done. The system was turning against her, and she was going to face the consequences of all the people she'd bullied for years. As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every single person who had ever felt powerless in the face of Karen's petty rule enforcement. We were winning. And the best part? I didn't even have to lift a finger to make it happen. The people around me, the judge, the state board, everyone who'd seen the truth had rallied to make sure justice was served. So when I walked outside the next morning, I took a deep breath and looked at my front door. My beautiful red door, the door that had been the center of this whole crazy battle. I smiled. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was a symbol of standing up for what's right. And I had won. The last thing Karen was ever going to see from me, a big, fat mic drop. And honestly, it felt damn good.